So for me, leadership in general has given me a firsthand glimpse into, okay, this is how we can really transcend the lives of others. This is how we can better communities everywhere. This is how we can just better people.
Well, I'm absolutely delighted to be here with you, Gibran, live from the Mountain View office for Google. Such a pleasure to be here. What a great spot.
I'm so happy you're here. I'm so happy. And you know what? We were talking about it. Been chatting on Google Meet forever, meeting virtually. I'm just glad I can meet face to face and do this.
For today, you know, I'm just excited because you're going to share some of your insights. You've been working in this space with founders for quite some time.
Yeah, it's been a while. I mean, I worked at a startup. I was employee number 6 at a startup before coming to Google for Startups. And then I've been at Google for Startups with a stint at Google Cloud for Startups for now almost 5.5 years.
Yeah. It's such a cool job. And, just to give folks a bit more context about your role in sort of cultivating these programs, working closely with founders. And we're talking about some serious startups that are involved. I mean, I think over $500 million raised across this group of 70 founders across the world. So this is your sort of top founders from across the world being part of this particular program that you've put together.
100%. And that's the coolest part. I mean, imagine a situation where you get to do a program where you have founders across all sectors. Collectively, they've actually raised $670 million in venture funding, hired 3,500 employees total across all the startups in this cohort. And they're working on everything from healthcare to fintech to education to well-being. So just an incredibly eclectic community, all bounded by the fact that they're all founders going through that founder journey, which is so hard.
And so for our podcast, what I'm really excited about is you're going to share 3 points on what it takes to lead a startup. And I'm really excited, Gibran, because you've gathered so much insight through your experience and working with the research, obviously, from Google into this space. And so I think the first question actually is, why is it important to you? Why does this matter to you?
I would say, obviously, the founder of a startup, by default, has to be a leader. And I don't use that term lightly. I think a lot of times we are easy to label a manager as a leader. They may not be the same thing. And I think a lot of people who care about leadership, for whom leadership is an important term, they would agree with that. In my life, I played sports growing up. I've been around a lot of different leaders. I've held a lot of different roles at different organizations. I've been the recipient of great leadership, and I've been the recipient of bad leadership. And I know firsthand how much it can impact my life. And when you're around a great leader, when you're around a great coach as a kid, that can change, for example, how much you love that sport, how you see that sport, how that sport transcends your understanding of life in general, what you learn from it. When you're around bad leadership, a bad coach, it can completely mar your experience. You may just not even look at that sport again. You may not want to do that. And I think that's true of so many other things in life. So for me, leadership in general and being around good and bad leadership has given me a firsthand glimpse into, okay, this is how we can really transcend the lives of others. This is how we can better communities everywhere. This is how we can just better people. So leadership has always been important to me. And now it's so cool that my job is about working with an international community of leaders that happen to be founders of startups around the world.
Yeah. Look, you and I are so aligned on this.
Yeah.
And let's get jumping into your first point, which I really love and I think is critical for all the different contexts that we're going to focus on the founder as a leader. But your first point, Gibran, is effective founders communicate their vision. So tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you've talked about it before in one of your workshops where you talk about when you treat people like volunteers, you touch people with their head, their heart, and their wallet. So one of the things of being an effective leader is just recognizing that the people that you hire, what's motivating them goes beyond just money. Of course, it's a motivating factor, but there's elements beyond that. And so communicating your vision effectively is about impacting someone's, to me, their head and their heart. A really good founder who knows how to communicate their vision with clarity, what they can do then is they can find really talented people to come in and take that vision and perhaps take it to places it's never been before or own their role with tremendous clarity. But if you as a founder can't speak with clarity, how can people understand their role in your organization with clarity? It can't really, those two things have to be hand in hand. And so founders that have ability to communicate why they're doing this. How is their product or service really benefiting the end user? What's the vision for this? Founders that have an ability to do that, I think they hit those two elements of the head and the heart really well. And they get that motivation, that inspiration out of the people that work for them. And they get the best work out of the people around them.
Yeah, and it's not easy being part of a startup, right? Like you are, you touched on kind of the three motivators around sort of personal motivations around head, heart, and wallet. And, different people are motivated at different stages of their life and their career. And specifically, I think in the startup context, what you and I have seen, I know with our work together with this community is, yeah, you're really at times you're not leaning in with the wallet. It's not, especially early stage startups and those folks that are just trying to figure out their market fit and so on, and really kind of getting people bought into, as you say, why it's important and what this could look like in 5 years, 10 years, and how it's going to impact people is just so critical. I know, for example, even with our small business and the work that we're doing, I'm working with more and more playmakers, folks that are going to come in and be part of our sort of process and deliver workshops. And oftentimes, we're really selling the vision about what it's going to look like in 2 or 3 years, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And they really buy into it and they kind of get it. But that's so important, isn't it?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And we're talking big picture, right? I think it goes beyond that. It can go day to day. One of the best things that actually a colleague of mine at Google once said, I work with a very international team. Some of them are native English speakers. Some of them are English was a second language, but they speak it because they're working in an international company like Google. But one of the best things this colleague told me, who's not a native English speaker, was that they said, Gibran, when you really want me to dive in on a specific strategy that you have for which you want feedback, I really appreciate when you write it and send it to me beforehand. English is not a native language to me. So when you're bringing up a new strategy for the first time verbally, I just can't absorb it the same way. But if you're putting it in writing and allowing me to read it, my ability to think critically around it and give you feedback is just exponentially better. So I think some of the best founders not only have an ability to be incredibly articulate verbally, but they have a great writing ability. And especially when we're in a post-COVID world where people are making hiring decisions across the world, you're hiring people in different countries, or you're internationalizing in general, the ability to write with clarity and then communicate that to a giant team that some of whom may not be native speakers of the language that the company's operating in, native English speakers, for example, it's a great way to get everyone bought in, and it's a great way to get everyone on the same page. So there's different ways of also communicating clarity, and I think it's not just spoken, it's written as well.
Oh, you have either intentionally or inadvertently helped prepare us for your second point. Using no as a framework is a must-have. It's a must-do for founders.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is huge. From talking to, I think at this point, talked to thousands of founders, what's become really clear is probably one of the hardest parts of the founder journey is that there's 1,000 questions that are unanswered. Your job as a founder is not to answer all of them. It's to prioritize which questions are the most urgent and the most important to answer. What's the problem we need to solve today to move our organization forward, to continue developing what we do? In order to do that, you have to say no. Sometimes you have to say no to yourself when you're tempted to divert your attention to something that is not the highest priority. Sometimes you have to say no to your employees who may want to venture out and they're focusing on the wrong problem. And in certain situations, particularly I feel like of founders who have those Series B, Series C companies, they're getting some good clientele. Sometimes you have to say no to a client who's simply asking something from your company that's far beyond your bandwidth. And if you try to fulfill that, what you're going to do is a disservice to all your other clients and perhaps a disservice to your team who's going to be overstretched. So saying no, I think, allows you in this giant, vast ocean of unanswered questions. Saying no is the key to keep you focused on the questions that actually matter.
Wow, I can completely relate and understand the benefits, and yet I can hear the voice in my head going, I'm rejecting that. That's too difficult. How do you do that? Because it's not easy to do that, right? And especially with the limited data set that you might have as a founder, there's the first challenge of being able to discern what's a priority, what's the most important thing, and then to have the courage to say no to a client? I mean, when you said that, I was going, oh, geez, could you, at that stage, as you say, you're picking up momentum. You probably have gotten there as well because you've said yes a lot. So, what's the advice you give to founders and leaders to help sort of cultivate that culture first within themselves to say no, and then expanding that to their team?
Well,
It's obviously super easy, right?
there's an element of cultivating that skill.
Mm.
And then to your point, I think you use a very important word. There's an element of uh, having the courage. For founders who are worried about both, I would say very fundamentally talk to other founders. That's the thing about, to me, being a founder, it's so intriguing. Uh, the majority of the thing, there is no clear roadmap or blueprint on how to be an effective founder. And usually the most important lessons you can learn haven't been written down yet. And so the best thing you can do is just tap into a network of other founders. And so when you hear the story of another founder who can tell you, I made the difficult decision to say no, and this is what was a result of it. I once told a client who was by far our biggest client, I told them no, and this is what ended up a result. The world didn't come crashing down. Things didn't self-destruct. Life went on. In fact, our company prospered because of that. Hearing stories like that are one of the biggest things you can do to get that inner belief, to get that courage to say, you know what, I'm going to make that hard call. And then, of course, then you can also learn how to think strategically, how to focus on the most important questions. I think part of that is innate. I mean, you have to have that innate ability as a founder to discern what's important and what's not at that moment. But part of it is you can definitely draw inspiration and insights from hearing from other founders who've been there and done that already.
Again, another insight and trend from your experience working globally with founders, and I certainly agree with this third point, is that startups reflect their founders' qualities, both good and bad.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's funny. I've learned this through countless conversations with founders. I've also learned this from a previous startup I've worked at. It's a hard lesson to learn, and I empathize with the part as a founder. It is very difficult emotionally to say I've got a 50-person organization. I clearly have some bad parts with my culture. I've got parts with my culture that just aren't good. I want to improve. And the hard truth is that it started with that founder. It doesn't mean they're a bad person. It doesn't mean they're a bad leader, but it just means we're human. And so if you are a founder, for example, who from the genesis of your company, you shied away from difficult conversations, guess what's happening the entire time that you're having the co-founders, you're building employees? They're looking to you as the North Star of how to behave, whether you know it or not. And that's a very difficult reality, I think, for a lot of founders to accept. And so if you as a founder have been avoiding difficult conversations your whole life, what you're signaling to everyone you ever hire in a way is that that behavior is acceptable. And so if 2, 3, 4 years in, all of a sudden you're looking at an organization where people are just afraid to have those slightly difficult conversations, afraid to disagree with each other, afraid to perhaps challenge each other, and you're wondering how that came about. Well, part of that is it's a behavior you have to correct in yourself, and part of it is it happened because you had that quality, and in a way, people looked to you and they embodied it themselves. They felt like they're part of an organization that allows for that. It's a very difficult conversation to have with founders. It's a hard thing to accept.
Serious blind spots, really. And again, in this work, we're always trying to, from a development space, always trying to help people uncover both hidden strengths, both things that they maybe didn't realize they're really good at and they should do more of. And then to your point, these blind spots that are enabling certain behaviors. And I'm curious, like, what's been, in your experience, the best way for founders to unlock these blind spots to get to a point where they can start to actually assess and evaluate things that they may be unintentionally accepting as kind of a cultural norm within their startup?
Yeah, I'll give you two things. I think one that I think is the most effective and the thing that's second place. First thing is see a coach. I think I've been seeing a coach now personally also for about 8 months, and it's been by far one of the most transformational things I've done. Because you know this, Tony, a great coach will hold up a mirror and ask you the right questions, the right guiding questions on your own journey of self-exploration. As the coachee, as the client, your job is to then show up and see what's in that mirror and accept the truth and do something about it. So the first thing what you can do as a founder, if you see a great coach, every single session, they're going to hold up that mirror and they're going to allow you to see a blind spot you could have never seen on your own. And so blind spots are really about the things that you're not aware of, especially in your darkest moments, in your most stressful moments, qualities you're not aware of that come out. After every coaching session, I really come out of it feeling mixed emotions because it was so heavy. But at every level, it definitely has helped me to grow as a person, to grow, I think, in my awareness, self-awareness. One of the best things that I realize is my personality, I've always been a doer. And I have a pretty high engine for doing things and getting things done. But if there's anything I've ever learned, is that I stretch myself. I take on too many projects. But to be honest, before seeing a coach, I didn't know the why. And one of the foundational lessons I learned is that when I'm calm, when I'm confident, I observe the surroundings around me. I observe what I need to do. I see it like a landscape. And then I select the thing that matters most and focus on that.
So it's effective. It works for you when you're calm.
When I'm calm. But when I'm anxious, when I'm nervous, what I do is I rush into things. I find the very first task that's right in front of me and I try to focus on that. And I just drill into that as hard as I can in an effort to feel like I'm controlling the situation. So it's this perfectionist kind of focus on one thing without really questioning if it's the most important thing. I kind of blindly go and follow that in order to feel like I'm controlling the situation. And it's all because I'm afraid in that situation. It's because I'm feeling doubt. I'm feeling something that is making me feel like if I can just feel like I'm in control for 1 second, it'll help me overcome the fear. But that's not what's happening.
Gosh, you're very generous to be so vulnerable and share that.
Yeah.
With 1 million listeners minimum. No, it's look, it's really insightful, and thanks for, I think, certainly more illuminating for me now in terms of how you would define a blind spot and your own journey. What I love about what you shared is the why behind, and I think that's where the real change and growth can happen, when you understand what's happening within you that is causing you to act and behave in a certain way outside of you. And interestingly, it resonates. I think, my own blind spot that I uncovered about 4 years ago, before I'd actually started the business, which is good, that I knew before I started, was that, like you, when I'm under pressure or feeling a bit stressed or a little anxious, I start to hone into the detail as well. I get into the minutia of something. I'll focus on, if it's if I'm designing a session, I'll focus on one small part of one slide and I'll just spend hours on it trying to figure out, this and that, or I'll be on a spreadsheet and I'll focus on that for scheduling. And I get into the detail, and it is driven by that sense of, I want to control this. I need to feel in more control of a certain, task or piece of work. Thankfully with me, because I was aware of it, and this is certainly one thing I would encourage, leaders and founders to do, is I shared that with my team. And so, for example, David, in our team, if he sees that before I do, he calls it out, and he pulls me out of that sort of place where I'm getting into the detail, clearly stressed, clearly under pressure, and not operating in my most effective self. So I think sharing that with your team as a founder, as a leader, is really great, because they can help hold you to account in a really positive way. I'm curious, and it's something I feel like I've done the show of hands with before to do a bit of a straw poll, is I wonder how many of our founders in this summit, or how many founders, and what percentage in your experience, are actually utilizing a coach.
Yeah.
I'd be curious.
Yeah. I think the last numbers I saw, we have about a third of our founders in this cohort are seeing a coach, or have at least seen a coach for a few sessions.
Only a third.
Yeah.
Which I think is striking.
Right. And I think, it should be more. And what's funny is that every single program I've run where I've now brought in coaches to coach founders, 2 data points have emerged that I think are really interesting. A fraction of the cohort would utilize a coach. And of the fraction that does, they have overwhelmingly positive things to say about it. So you have a small minority that's willing to do the hard work of seeing a coach, that's willing to put in the time. And within those, they absolutely love it. But that enthusiasm and even those testimonials, they haven't been enough, at least what I've seen so far, to cascade through the entire cohort and get more people signing up to see a coach.
Yeah. And it's because I think what you're saying, like, it's hard.
It's very hard.
Especially when it comes to hard things to do with something that you care so deeply about. And for these founders, we talked about heart motivation earlier, but a lot of these founders are so driven, by their mission, by their vision for their company. that I can see why it would be difficult. Anyway, I cut you off from your second nugget you were going to share in
No,
this
yeah.
space.
So first thing is to see a coach. The second thing is just, again, I would say hear from another founder. But I think the caveat I would put in this is you don't want to hear that that kind of sexy, cleaned up, posh talk from a founder about, it's never, no founder will ever say it's a linear journey to grow their company, but for the most part, they'll say, oh, I was able to do this and I got to X result. No, you want a founder who's willing to be very vulnerable, very raw, and very honest. A founder, we've had two founders in the last 6 months with this cohort. We brought in two founders who were acquired by Google to lead talks for our founder cohort. And in both situations, they were able to talk with such vulnerability. They were able to talk about incredibly sensitive things in their own lives, mistakes they made, difficult decisions they had to make, things that they really wish they could go back and change. But you want to hear that part, because that is what's really going to allow you to then see the blind spots in yourself. Because when you see someone else courageous enough to say, in hindsight, this is what I didn't see, I think that's a very good motivating tool to start looking at it in yourself. So I think, again, those vulnerable, very raw, honest talks from other founders, I think are really helpful in finding your blind spot.
Yeah, I love that. It's really like there's the theme across the two is really getting outside of your own head.
Yes,
right.
Absolutely.
So getting with a coach, getting with others, I think is amazing. And to your point, yeah, there is a culture in the startup world about showing yourself off in the best light, but really the real value is in the vulnerability and showing up and being honest about failures, which I know, you really focus on in the programs that you're cultivating. Two things that came to mind, Gibran, when you were talking about this kind of third point. The first is, because we spent a little bit of time there talking about blind spots, and what I've noticed in the work that I do with leaders is that an overused strength can quickly become a weakness. And I'll give you an example, and I've seen it in a couple of, I don't want to call them startups because they're fairly mature. You're talking about 1,500 employees, roughly, global presence. The two that I'm thinking about are both publicly traded companies now, but certainly what I've seen with them is that they start off very people-focused, very consensus-driven, which is a wonderful strength to have and a great thing to utilize and can really serve you until it's overused. And then it becomes, as you were describing, people are so focused on how people feel and they're scared to have the tough conversations. And it's so interesting because I know we're talking about perhaps startups that are maybe dealing with 50, 100, 150, 200 employees. But I've certainly seen that when they even get to 1,500 because it doesn't go away. And so, one thing I think is really important for founders, and we hear this all the time in our program, is getting there quicker in their leadership journey. I mean, how many times have we heard it in this program over the last 2-3 years where they've said, I wish I had accessed this leadership program earlier in my startup journey.
So true.
Second thing I was going to share was, and again, I've had this with another startup. They're not publicly traded. They are growing pretty fast. And we were working with them trying to think about how they set up kind of explicit leadership behaviors that they want to see from their people managers across the globe. And what was really interesting was this particular founder was like, I'm not interested in doing that. I don't want to be so prescriptive. It was really interesting and quite challenging for me because on one hand, I quite admire the fact that this founder wants to keep things quite authentic or organic. But on the other hand, I think as you scale, and this goes back to your first point, you need to be able to communicate clearly and effectively what it is you expect of your leaders and your teams in order to kind of further realize your vision in the way that you want, because how you achieve something, I feel, is just as important as what you achieve.
Yes, exactly. And I mean, to that point, it goes back to one of the things we're just talking about, which is it is very hard as a founder. I think it probably add even more pressure to acknowledge the fact that you are the North Star that everyone's looking to. So exactly to your point, Tony, when that team scales, especially, and you went from our co-founders were all working in the same office, the same co-working space, to 20 employees that are still in the same city, to now we're 1,500, we're global, we're distributed. what you have to acknowledge in that moment is even then the subtle things that you do send a signal to your company. So for example, in meetings, in an all hands meeting, what you choose to celebrate and what you choose to take as a learning opportunity and what you verbalize to everyone in that all hands call sends a signal to all 1,500 employees, whether you know them personally or not. It sends a signal to them about what does this company represent? What is important to us? What are the values that we celebrate? What are the things that we take away even from our failures? All of the things that are important to you, you have to utilize every platform you have to send a signal, especially as you scale. Send a signal to all your employees. This is what we're about. And it doesn't, to that founder's point, it doesn't have to be a prescriptive thing. It's not like, hey, just so everyone knows, we are all about leaning into difficult conversations. And people are just going to acknowledge and they're going to go on with their work. They're going to think it's very cliche. It's something you can show yourself. It's a story you can tell. And so I think there's elements there where I think as a founder, it can be stressful or scary to think every behavior of mine is being perceived by the folks around me, or it could turn into one of your best strengths, where you utilize every platform you have to communicate your values to your company. And in this founder's case, you don't have to do it prescriptively. You just got to do it through your own behavior, but you have to embody that. And that's how you signal it to everybody else.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more that the lead by example piece is so important, and especially if you're visible as a founder.
Yeah.
I'm thinking about these organizations where, in an organization of 1,500 people, you might not see and hear from the founder very regularly, and so it's very difficult to understand what do they expect. And we're sitting here in Google, and one of the things that when I worked here, certainly felt that there were things around being quote unquote googly, or don't do evil.
Yeah.
Controversial to bring this up, but these were things that I found to be really clear about. Oh, okay, that's how I'm to behave. And certainly for us, even in our small business, and even though we're growing and we're bringing more people into the fold, there are certainly things that I want to make sure that are kind of not cliche, but really clear principles about this is how I think we should behave. One thing that our team are always talking about is done is better, meaning done is better than perfect, because oftentimes the type of people that gravitate towards people playbook, people that want to, really do the best work, which is a wonderful strength to have and a great quality, until it's not, until it holds us back. So, I always think that for founders, as we talked about, even though they might be clear when they're all sitting in the same office, as they scale, just having some really key language is going to be really important as they grow and as more people join their organization.
Absolutely. And Tony, one of the things I'm shocked with is the volume at which, so I'm not saying it happens all the time, but still the volume at which founders tell me or employees tell me in startups, we're not shipping products fast enough. So I think you talked a little bit earlier too about what are sometimes qualities that can be really good, but when overused, they become destructive. You have some founders who are just brilliant engineers perhaps, or they just know how to design great products, but they're terrified about putting any blemished product out in the market and having it dissected and picked apart by users. And so subsequently they kind of just focus on every single detail rather than shipping that product out there, knowing there's no way your first product's your last product. So exactly to your point, I think if you as a founder can acknowledge that, take away that perfectionist side of you, done is better. Just get it done, ship it out, learn from users, talk to them, interact with them, and then be able to bring that and iterate your next version. And then secondly, tell that story at your next all hands.
Yes, very good.
Let everyone know. We actually decided to gather some user research, build a product, ship it out, and get user feedback all within 6 weeks. Here's what we learned. This was a tremendous win for the company. These are the types of things that send a signal to everybody else. Act, get things done, do it more. So it's those are the things that I think I see founders, they struggle with, but they can turn those things into a positive.
For that. What's amazing is all of these seem to overlap really well in terms of your 3 points, right? Around that communication piece, around that saying no, and critically, although it's the third point, probably the most important is, yes, recognizing that your startup reflects you as a founder.
Yeah.
And so for better, for worse, the more awareness you can gain about how you're showing up and how your behavior, actions, mindset impacts your startup is so critical. So tell me this, Gibran, as we get ready to wrap up on our podcast. I'm really keen to hear if our founders listening and our leaders listening were to implement all the things we've just talked about, how might the world change?
Well, it goes back to one of the things I honestly would connect to my personal story about why I know the world would change is because, again, I've been the recipient of very exceptional leadership and bad leadership. And it's remarkable how leaders impact so many things, not just with their employees, but then those employees learn new behaviors that they then impart to maybe their employees if they start a company, to their kids, to their spouses, to their families. So I think leadership, great leadership, no one would dispute, is about having those values and being able to kind of permeate those values across the people that you work with. So if you can have a program where you are empowering really exceptional leaders, giving them new ways to improve into even more authentic leaders, and they can then impart that wisdom, that leadership to 3,500 employees, for example, that we have in this program, 3,500 employees across all the startups that we work with. And each of those 3,500 people then kind of impart those values broader and broader. You can kind of see that cascading effect that I'm talking about. It really broadens. So leadership is just so great because what it does is, again, it helps people to both refine their own values, get clarity on what's important to them, but it also helps people to then impart and share that with everybody else. So there's this tremendous ripple effect that happens with great leadership. That's what makes me excited to do this job.
Thank you, Gibran. I just love the piece around the intentionality for our leaders as well, to be really clear on what it is they're doing and make a choice. It's fantastic. Listen, I've absolutely loved this. Thank you, and thank you for allowing us to join you in the office. It's been so fun.
I'm glad you can be here, and thanks for having me. Really appreciate it.